getting into the nit and gritty of the Anunnaki origins in the beginning, and it's just so fascinating. I was just talking to Gerald on the break, and how the penny has dropped even on the show, and I keep having these realizations of in the profound depths of this whole Sumerian tales. First of all, welcome back to the show, Gerald.
Thanks, buddy. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you know, so much to get into another show, Gerald, and I like what we're doing. I like that we're getting into some philosophy, some, you know, tying things together and connecting things, as well as talking about some historical data as well. You need to give the data to philosophize about it, and I like the mix that we're doing here. There's a few things I want to mention, Gerald. I mean, I just briefly, you know, we talk about Nibiru, or Nibiru as people call it. I want to just mention, just throw this one in, the IRAS satellite data. And this is just for the naysayers out there, Gerald. Nobody talks about this. How did this stuff get swept under the carpet, this IRAS satellite, stuff? Let's talk about this.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I'm actually very surprised that the video I had up for a very long time documenting that Zecharia Sitchin met with Dr. Harrington to discuss this concept of a planet out at the edge of our solar system could have possibly caused the perturbations of the orbital plane of Neptune and Uranus, and Pluto as well, but mostly those bigger planets, because it had to be something quite large to affect a large planet's ecliptic relative to the sun and its orbit. So it put it on an inclined plane. And, you know, so the idea that this was the focal point of our astrologers and scientists to try to understand what happened out there, such that these planets were not on the same, orbital plane with the solar ecliptic, that something had to have caused it. So you know, Dr. Harrington, was aware of that, and it was not a new problem to scientists. For, you know, lots of them were trying to come up with theories of what happened out there. So the idea that he invited Sitchin to come and explain his theory that he had, and it wasn't even really his theory, it was his interpretation of the Babylonian epic of creation, the Enuma Elish. And apparently Harrington had read it as well, and realized that that whatever happened there was clearly seminal, and that it warranted developing a satellite or a probe like the infrared astronomical scope satellite to try and find out what was going on out there. So he was very much a part of commissioning that research. And so when he met with Sitchin and they talked about the Enuma Elish and whether it was telling the correct story, the bottom line is Harrington agreed that it was. And the only difference he felt in his mind relative to the pattern or the pathway that had been drawn in the elliptical orbit for Nibiru by Sitchin was that it hadn't fully taken into account the precession of the equinox, but it was the same exact pattern, just showed up in a different zodiacal house as it came into the close perihelion with the sun. So those two walked away in complete agreement, and it was documented on video. And it came out in, I don't know, 3 to 5 different newspaper articles, starting from the time that Sitchin wrote his book until I think it was the mid 80s, and then later, even in the 90s, there was another group of people that looked at this again and said, based on all the evidence, you know, Pioneer 10, 11, and all the IRS data, it's clear there is a 10th planet in our solar system. Call it Planet X, which the X in Roman numerals represented 10. And in the scientific realm, X oftentimes is used as a variable that could take on other names, right? So
sure.
It was appropriately named when they called it Planet X.
Yeah. Do you think, Gerald, perhaps it's some people call it the Nibiru system, that it's like a red dwarf, brown dwarf type sun with planets orbiting around it. So on some of the orbiting planets of the red brown dwarf, maybe closer to it, getting enough heat, just enough light that they're able to survive on the planet. Obviously, you're not going to survive on a brown dwarf. It's like a miniature little system in itself, Gerald.
Well, yeah. If you look at the Babylonian epic of creation in Enuma Elish, this is over 11 tablets of very complicated planetary interactions. They painted it as I guess they painted it as a celestial battle, an allegory to a celestial battle. These billiard ball planets running into each other. Now, imagine your planet. And I have a theory. I've never discussed this with anyone before, but I'll tell you right now. We just went through what and I think we're still going through the galactic center. I think it takes some time to go.
20 years, maybe, John.
Well, minimally, I think it takes 3.5 years, because the 3.5 comes up in Revelations and other places about this 1,260 days when the two witnesses kind of thing. Well, if you tie this back into the timing with what Dr. Kellerman pointed out, it didn't actually happen on December 21st, 2012, even though that's what we were guided to believe. It actually happened in October 28th, 2011. Mm-hmm. So I think, add 3.5 years to that, you could see that we could, if that's true, we could be coming to kind of an apex of the height of consciousness, to the point where they understood when you left the dark rift that then human consciousness started going to sleep. Which, from an energy standpoint, knowing about these latent circuits, the amount of radiation and energy that's in the flattened nebula that surrounds the black hole, the center of our galaxy. I mean, it's a massive amount of energy. So much gravitational increase and effect on photons that they're being sucked into the threshold of the black hole and being recycled. Even light. Mm. So the idea that our solar system is wobbling through the galactic center, well, that appears to be what established this 26,000-year cycle that the Anunnaki used to tell time on our planet. Well, it's kind of a crazy thing. So I think we're going through that right now, and when we leave it, there's going to be problems. I lost my train of thought where I was going to try and take you with that, but there was something there about the Mayans, the dark rift, and consciousness.
Mm. Oh, the Mayans. Anyway. To come back to the Mayans, Gerald. I mean, these guys were so sophisticated in their astronomy. I mean, they had the solar year to 4 decimal places, Gerald. I mean, more
right.
accurate.
Oh. Well, exactly. Well, when you realize the accuracy that they had, and now you realize it came from Ningshita, this premier scientist, you start to, give a lot more credence to this guy. He was absolutely the quintessential of what we would term brilliant. I mean, just brilliant in all aspects. Because their calendar is fascinating, really fascinating.
I love the Mayan cosmology. It is a very, very advanced, sophisticated body of knowledge, Gerald. It's a body of knowledge. To think that a few of those books survived, Gerald.
Yeah, that was a whole story in Dresden when at the end of World War II, when the war was over, and I wouldn't have known this had I not been traveling back and forth to Dresden, Germany, where our factory was for LightPoint. We had our manufacturing facility there, and then I've come to find out that I'm right next to the headquarters of the Saxony Kings and the Frauenkirche that was bombed, and they were still putting it back together piece by piece like a jigsaw puzzle, like Legos when I was there. And actually in 2002, they were just putting the capstone back onto that church from when it was bombed after World War II. Now, I wanted to talk about that in relation to the Mayan Codex. It was a very interesting story. And that apparently some of the early German researchers had gone to the Yucatan and gotten some of these codices from the Mayan to try and decode the language. And one of them ended up in the museum there in the Saxony Kings in Dresden, in that area, in the museum. And at the end of World War II, when I guess the decision was made to teach the Germans a lesson and go hit them at their cultural capital and make, just to let them know that we're the boss and that you're going to surrender unconditionally, whatever it was that made them go do this heinous act. They went in and, after the war was over, and completely sacked the city of Dresden, its cultural capital, including the museum where this Mayan Codex was hidden away. Well, apparently, from the story, the museum was destroyed. All its contents were all over the ground. And some soldier apparently was walking through this rubble and looked at a strange-looking book, happened to pick it up, and it turned out to be one of the Mayan codices that survived.
Wow.
That's crazy, isn't it?
Wow.
That's just crazy. So, anyway, so the idea of energy, timing of galactic wobble. Oh, where I was leading, I remember now. Now, think about Nibiru as an invader planet. Clearly, Sitchin thought it was, and so did Harrington after he described this in this video. And I put it back up on my website, Gerald Clark 7700 Media. I got that video still up. Now, it belongs to somebody else, but I'm sharing it, okay? But it's been up for a while, and I don't know how much longer it's going to be up, because there are forces out there that don't want the truth out, and everybody ought to be aware of that by now. So, but what I was going to tell you was, at some point in their cosmogony, in the Enuma Elish, their planet ended up going through some process where it then got trapped into our solar system. Well, my theory is that when you go through the galactic center, there's a lot of reshuffling of the billiard balls because of this variation in the gravity field, external energy, probably because of that, a rotating body that would strike that would experience a gradient field that could cause possibly changes in its polar orbit. So if it's rotating about an axis and it strikes something, think about a helicopter. Any rotating body that has an input force on it will experience a concept called let's see, what's it called? Gyroscopic precession. So if you input a force on a rotating body, it'll manifest 90 degrees in the direction of rotation. Well, imagine a rotating body like a planet striking the gradient field of the dark rift as it's oscillating through this wobbling black hole. So the black hole itself at the center of our galaxy is causing the wobble. So it's wobbling, which means all the planets that are being drug around in its nebula, spinning around, are also wobbling up and back through the center of this Milky Way galaxy ecliptic, okay? So we experience that every about 13,000 years, and actually it turns out to be 25,920 years to go all the way around, where you've wobbled up, created a complete sinusoidal wobble, okay? So I believe that's exactly what Ningshita was aware of when he was back in Africa programming our DNA. How many times had they seen this before?
Ace up the sleeve, Gerald. That was Ningshita's.
And they knew the energetic effect on through the electromagnetic spectrum, and I think he programmed us with this 9 rows of the Solkan calendar, now that you realize it was him, to expose you to the idea of how, as you get closer to this galactic center and the source of this energy that wakes us up to the highest consciousness, he did it in stages, starting all the way back to the creation of time on this planet, and then started telescoping by a decrementing scale of 20 with 13 columns, 7 days of creation and 7 nights of destruction, and they alternate. So there's that magic number 13 in the columns, right?
Sure.
And then going up in the rows, he started out at the very cellular level and walked the consciousness level all the way up to where we are now, which is at the universal consciousness. Now, what I'm positing here is that disturbance that happened at that galactic center, I believe that is the defining event that probably disturbed Nibiru's orbit, caused all this galactic allegory of the planetary battle that shows up in the Enuma Elish. And I believe that's the place where they ended up trapped in our solar system's orbit. And it is pretty clear when they tell it from their standpoint that it looks like that's what happened. And on the first go around, they didn't have a collision. Some of their planets around, or their satellites, if you will, or their stars, or their moons of Nibiru, apparently did have collisions. In the first, in the Enuma Elish, for instance, one of their, initially, for the first pass through perihelion, once they got trapped, they described this. They had one of their satellites, strike an object, which they knew was going to cause a problem for them. And as a matter of fact, this is where Mumu comes up, because the very first thing they talk about is the relationship between Mercury and the Sun and what was going to happen when they went into close perihelion. That's very telling, okay?
Awesome.
Well, the second time around, they described their planet actually striking Tiamat. And Tiamat was in the place of where the Earth was prior to this happening. And I go through this decoding the Enuma Elish for people and try to do the blow by blow like they told it.
Yeah.
But I also then back up and retell it with a higher level meta awareness, like you would tell a story without being blow by blow like a sportscaster.
Sure.
But so I did that in the first book, and the second one I even refined it even more. But this idea that their planet struck Tiamat, broke it in pieces. Part of it became the Earth. Part of it became Kingu, our moon. Has been, our scientists have been sneaking up on understanding that since science began on this planet. at least for our primitive workers as it was disclosed to them, to understand what happened. And you know, we're just now getting sophisticated enough to understand the Enuma.
Well, I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people have purported this new Nibiru story as the main body of evidence, and I wanted to get some of that IRAS satellite background in there. And this is a factual reality. We're not just talking some Sumerian accounts. There's modern day stuff going on, verifying ancient stuff, and that's for other people to do. Yeah. That's for other people to do the extra research if they want. And
well, so what that brings up is the question of, you know, when is Nibiru coming? Because it looks like clearly, periodically, if it comes through like they said, there'll be gravitational impact effects. The Earth's going to get perturbed, and blah blah blah. And you know, I think that clearly does happen. It doesn't happen every time. It depends on where the Earth is relative to Nibiru when it comes through the planet as the crossing point, right? Mm-hmm. That's the most important point. So, you know,
that's incredibly hard to predict, though, Gerald.
Well, it is, and then also when you have a long elliptical orbit for a planet, guess what? It's not like clockwork. It could be off plus or minus, according to how far that one is, plus or minus 50 years.
Yeah.
So it's not, you know, okay, it's going to be here on the winter solstice of this date. It's going to cross through. Well, you can expect that, but I would proffer to you that that's why the Lucifer scope went up on Mount Graham, is to keep track of when that planet is actually coming through. Now, from the Earth changes we're seeing, I do believe that this galactic transit, the dark rift transit of our planet, is definitely causing perturbations. You know, and even the founder of the Weather Channel admits and is a big, strong proponent of the fact that mankind is not causing this. This is a galactic wobble issue. We're facing forces that are affecting our adjacent planets as well. So the idea that, you know, because we're putting carbon-based fuels in our SUV and that we're all responsible for this so that we can be taxed for breathing. Al Gore, you can kiss my butt. You are a moron. Okay, I'm going to say it over the air. And you have no business being in the weather business, so get out. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, that said, we are experiencing massive changes. And according to Einstein, even in Charles Hapgood's book that was written in the 50s,
oh, yeah.
he wrote the opening to that book discussing the potential of our plate tectonic skins taking a wild ride if the orbital velocity or angular momentum of the planet Earth was changed by anything suddenly. So imagine you got a spinning gyroscope and you change its, or introduce a wobble suddenly just by something passing that has a gravitational impact for it, or magnetic or electromagnetic. Either way, all the fields are related that way. And so there's oftentimes, you know, if you have an airplane flying through the air, it creates parasitic drag that the electrostatic charge needs to be dissipated before you touch it. So they have electrostatic dischargers on the end of the wings to discharge that electricity because you're gathering this as you fly through the air. Now think about a big planet that's been doing this, comes close to another planet. It's like, okay, there's a difference in charge here. It's like a battery. They're going to try to equalize. So you could have a large arcing effect of electricity from one to the other that potentially explains some of the stuff we see on the surface of Mars.
The electrical scarring.
Yeah, so the idea that what Einstein described as a sudden, almost like a skin on an orange that could suddenly shift when the rotating body stops, and the outside skin would continue rotating with the body while the core, you know, it does something quite different. Well, if that happened on a planet that was composed mostly of water, like the Earth, imagine the size of tidal waves you could produce going over the land if that happened. I'm talking, you know, thousands of feet high, not a little shore incursion like we saw in Indonesia, even though it was terrible, up to, you know, maybe even 100 feet high. But we're talking a mile high or more. I mean, that's incredible to think about if you suddenly stop the orientation or wobble of the Earth. Well, similarly, another problem that could occur is you generally on a planet like ours, because of how the sun strikes the surface and it's spinning, the poles get really cold and you build up ice caps. Well, now introduce a wobble, and this ice has a very different density than air or even water. So now all of a sudden you got something with significant density and you know, and it's sitting on the poles where the orientation axis and the angular momentum tries to seek the middle, just like an ice skater that brings their arms in, right? They start spinning faster around their line. Well, this this ice built up on the poles actually slows the ice skater from spinning at a certain rate. Well, all of a sudden, if it breaks off because of a sudden wobble, it's going to head toward the equator, right where the loose objects, the plate tectonic skins can go. And all of a sudden, what's that going to do to imagine a ball going around, all the weight ends up around the midline like a hula hoop. Now all of a sudden you got this lump going around and it could cause some sort of resonance that's even worse than what was before. You see what I'm saying? So it will cause a chain reaction of things that will try to get back to homeostasis on this spherical body that was rotating at balance at some point. So, the idea of pole shifts and all these other problems happening because of a passing planet or as you're going through the galactic center. In and of itself, imagine where you are relative to your sun and the energy it's producing. Mm-hmm. So if you're on the windward side, not the leeward side of the sun, relative to the galactic center, that sun could be putting off CMEs and stuff that normally might be projected out and away from your planet. But all of a sudden now, because of the focusing energy of the dark rift that's pulling it toward the galactic center, and you're right in the way, you might get a focused blast of energy and completely torch the surface of your Earth. So that's possible too.
Wow.
So just because the Nibiru's going by, you could have changes, but going through the dark rift is a serious business. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's serious. So if you didn't have an atmosphere, you wouldn't survive it. It's that serious.
Such a complex playground of research that even the Sumerian tales can lead you into the processional knowledge. And I mean, these guys, the Sumerians, these guys didn't just have what they left us; they had their own stuff too, their own knowledge. I mean, these guys were so advanced, and we have remnants of that.
Speaking of that, you bring up a funny story that I told in the first book that I'd almost forgotten. Now I'm re-recording the audiobook for my first book. Now that I've learned a little bit more about how to make a little better quality. I didn't get a lot of complaints, and I kept the price of the first book very, very low. I just wanted the information out there. But in that process, I was re-recording it, and I ran into some stuff that was pretty funny. And one of them was, I don't know, I've got a little bit of a sense of humor, and it showed up my second book. But part of it was Zog the Caveman. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the claymation accounts where this alien comes into an encounter with these barbarians living in caves. And it's trying to disseminate knowledge to them. And it's on YouTube. You can go look at some of these. But absolutely funny. Wow. And I was going somewhere with that, but I forgot where it was. But this dissemination of knowledge to these primitive workers relative to this ancient race it's really hard on your head. It's funny though when you back up and look at it.
Joe, I got little time left, and I want to save some time for the Lamentations of Ur. But before I get there, I want to talk about the Sumerian kingship and how it revolves. You can throw in, the Sumerian kings' ages if you like, and maybe just explain the kingship.
Okay.
The kingship, how it revolves, and why this ties in with the Lamentations of Ur.
Okay. Well, there was something interesting that I noticed when I was going through the Sumerian kings. First of all, I was trying to add up the time to see if this list given to us by Berossus could definitively state when they arrived. They said they came 450,000 years ago. And then if you look at the Sumerian kings list and you work it out, depending on which one you look at, the one that Berossus gave us actually goes back 420,000 years. Okay, so they're different pieces. So I tried to just focus on the ones that we had definitive knowledge on, okay? But the first 8 rulers before the big flood in the first part of the Sumerian kings list is very seminal because it looks like they all served complete shars, and their rulerships were listed in shar. They weren't broken up, and all the way through until you got to the last one. So it's like 176,500 years for the first 8 kings. And they moved the city from Ridu, where the first king was. Alulim was the king there. And it ended up in Sharupak at the end, because that's in Genesis 6 or so. You realize that's when the flood came for Noah. Actually, it was later in Genesis. But the flood came, and that was in Sharupak. Okay, so all of a sudden you got a Sumerian kings list that ties back with the Bible, and exactly the same time frame, 600 years after he was king. Okay, well that goes back to the Atrahasis. So that was all very interesting to me. So then you go from the first Sumerian kings list, flood happens, and you pick up the kings list in Mesopotamia. And you start looking at the list and go, well, how long did they serve relative to these other ones? All of a sudden, you see these reigns of the kings is getting shorter and shorter. I mean, down to really short, like now to us it's a long time, but when you look at the longest kings that were serving on the Sumerian kings list, the last one at Bad Tabira, in the first 8 rulers, he served 12 shars. That's 12 times 3,600 years. Okay? The very first one served 8 shars, which was 28,800 years. So the one at Bad Tabira, right before it ended up in Sharupak under Atrahasis, who was Zeusudra, he served for 12 shars. Okay? So if a shar was 4,000 years, that would be 48,000 years. So it's just short of 45,000 years he served. That's not how long he lived, that's how long he served. Now, so keep that in mind. Now jump to the Sumerian kings list that starts after the flood. Now you realize Enki is now gone down to Africa. The Mesopotamian region now belongs to Enlil. The Sinai is under Nanar-Sin, and the Indus Valley belongs to Inanna, or Hathor. Okay, so all of a sudden, you start seeing this merry-go-round of the kings that's going from city to city to city to city, and the reason the kingship moved was very telling too. It was like, and the king, and let's focus on just one for now. And there are lots of lamentations. Okay, well, these lamentation documents came up that were crying out about the destruction of their kingship and why it moved from city to city. Okay, so this was very interesting to me because in the kings list, the Sumerian kings list, you get a one-liner, and the kingship was defeated and was moved to this city. And I'm like, wow, you mean there was a battle and they were fighting? Who were they fighting? You know, there's just no detail at all. Well, then you go to these lamentations, and this is where the detail is. This is where you find out what these kings were saying about what happened to them before it got moved like a merry-go-round from here to here to here. Okay, so as an intro to that, the other reason I chose this particular one, it happened in the Sumerian city of Ur. Remember who was from the city of Ur? This was where Abram came from. His father Terah was working in this temple, serving this being that we're just about to talk about. Okay? Now, understand that Ur was the capital of Sumer twice. And there were other capitals there. I think Uruk was there once, and several. It moved around a lot, and you'll see it in the King's List, okay? So, the idea that we're in the place where God told Abram to leave his city and go take the land of Canaan is very seminal. I chose it for this reason. Now you're going to find out who the beings are in the city, what their relationships are, and why this kingship jumped all over the place. Okay? Keep in mind the spirit of these beings that we're talking about, because it goes all the way back to the Atrahasis. And that's the other thing I want to mention to you. In the Atrahasis, one of those beings led the Ajiji miners in a revolt. Okay? And his name, according to the account, was Allah. Okay? Well, we come to find out in my first book, I clearly identified him as Nanar-Sin. Okay? And where did he take the rebellious group that he was leading? Kind of like, in reality, he's a hero. He was standing up to the oppression that these beings were experiencing in the mind and said, this is enough. No, I'm representing their rights, and this is enough. So from that standpoint, he's already showing heroic characteristics in my mind, no matter how he's been portrayed through history. Shows up where? At his dad's house, Enlil's house. Okay, so now keep that in mind. Enlil got embarrassed in front of Anu and Enki over this issue with the Atrahasis because of Nanar. Because Allah led these people in a revolt. So keep that in mind when you read this particular lamentation, because it has deep roots in history of why it happened.
John, pause there. I'm going to play an excerpt from the audiobook, Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising. It's the lamentation of orated by yourself, Gerald. And just going to play that for the listeners so that they have a taste of what we're actually talking about. And,
actually, it's going to be more than a taste, and hold on to your seats.
And pay particular attention to the sentiment in the original writing. So I'm just going to play that, Gerald, and it's in the short clip.
I'm going to put it on mute, and I'm just going to listen.
For sure, it's a short clip.
You decide after reading the dreadful account for the destruction of the city of Ur. Lamentations for the destruction of Ur. Many lament texts have been found, each mourning the destruction of a different Sumerian city. This one speaks for itself. The goddess of Ur, Ningal, tells how she suffered under her sense of coming doom. when I was grieving for that day of storm destined for me, laid upon me, heavy with tears. That day of storm destined for me, laid upon me, heavy with tears, on me, the queen. Though I was trembling for that day of storm destined for me, I could not flee before that day's fatality. And of a sudden I espied no happy days within my reign, no happy days within my reign. Though I would tremble for that night of cruel weeping destined for me, I could not flee before that night's fatality. Dread of the storm's flood-like destruction weighed on me, and of a sudden upon my couch at night, no dreams were granted me. And of a sudden upon my couch oblivion was not granted, because this bitter anguish had been destined for my land. As the cow to the mired calf, even had I come to help it on the ground, I could not have pulled my people back out of the mire, because this bitter dolour had been destined for my city. Even if I, bird-like, had stretched my wings, and I, like a bird, flown to my city, yet my city would have been destroyed on its foundation, yet Ur would have perished where it lay. Because that day of storm had raised its hand, and even I had screamed out loud and cried, "Turn back, O day of storm, turn to thy desert," the breast of that storm would not have been lifted from me. Then verily to the assembly, where the crowd had not yet risen, while the Anunnaki, binding themselves to uphold the decision, were still seated, I dragged my feet, and I stretched out my arms. Truly, I shed my tears in front of On. Truly, I mourned in front of Enlil. May my city not be destroyed. I said indeed to them, may Ur not be destroyed. I said indeed to them, and may its people not be killed. I said indeed to them, but On never bent towards these words, and Enlil never with On. It is pleasing, so be it, did soothe my heart. Behold, they gave instruction that the city be destroyed. Behold, they gave instruction that Ur be destroyed, and, as its destiny decreed, that its inhabitants be killed. Enlil called the storm, the people mourn. Winds of abundance he took from the land, the people mourn. Good winds he took away from Sumer, the people mourn. Deputed evil winds, the people mourn, and trusted them to King Galuda, tender of storms. He called the storm that annihilates the land, the people mourn. He called disastrous winds, the people mourn. Enlil, choosing Gibil as his helper, called the great hurricane of heaven, the people mourn. The blinding hurricane howling across the skies, the people mourn. The tempest, unsubduable like breaks through the levees, beats down upon, devours the city's ships. All these he gathered at the base of heaven. The people mourn. Great fires he lit that heralded the storm. The people mourn, and lit on either flank of furious winds the searing heat of the desert. Like flaming heat of noon this fire scorched. The storm ordered by Enlil in hate, the storm which wears away the country, covered Ur like a cloth, veiled it like a linen sheet. On that day did the storm leave the city. That city was a ruin. I, Father Nana, that town was left a ruin. The people mourn. On that day did the storm leave the country. The people mourn. Its people's corpses, not potsherds, littered the approaches. The walls were gaping, the high gate, the roads were piled with dead. In the wide streets, where feasting crowds once gathered, jumbled they lay. In all the streets and roadways bodies lay. In open fields that used to fill with dancers, the people lay in heaps. The country's blood now filled its holes like metal in a mold. Bodies dissolved like butter left in the sun. Nanar, god of the moon and spouse of Ningal, appeals to his father Enlil. O my father who engendered me, what has my city done to you? Why have you turned away from it? O Enlil, what has my city done to you? Why have you turned away from it? The ship of first fruits no longer brings first fruits to the engendering father. No longer goes in to Enlil in Nippur with your bread and food portions. O my Father who engendered me, fold again into your arms my city from its loneliness. O Enlil, fold again in my into your arms from its loneliness. Fold again my temple from Akishingal into your arms from its loneliness. Let renown emerge from you in Let the people expand for you. Let the ways of Sumer, which have been destroyed, be restored for you. Enlil answered his son Swain, saying, The heart of the wasted city is weeping. Reeds for flutes of lament grow therein. Its heart is weeping. Reeds for flutes of laments grow in. Its people spend the day in weeping. O noble Nana, be thou concerned about yourself. What truck have you with fears? There is no revoking a verdict, a decree of the assembly. A command of On and Enlil is not known ever to have been changed. Was verily granted a kingship. A lasting term it was not granted. From days of yore, when the country was first settled, to where it has proceeded now, who ever saw a term of office completed? Its kingship, its term of office, has been uprooted. It must worry you, my Nana. Do you not worry. Leave your city.
Such a heartfelt, emotional account of a genocidal atrocity, Gerald. I mean, tell me that doesn't touch you in an intellectual way when you read or listen to that. Tell me that doesn't touch you.
Well, it's beyond an intellectual level. I have to tell you, as I was recording that in the audiobook, I had to stop the recording, and you heard the change in my voice. I was in tears after I heard that, realizing the hate that this woman, Ningal, the queen of the city, and really, if you realize how in the account, no discussion is talked about her. I think she died in the city with them. That's what she did. And, what a sorrowful lamentation to then have the father who worked with Anu to allow this. This really brings into question Anu's view of mankind as well. To have a father and son discussing this, and to have his dad tell him, well, I just nuked your city from both sides of the flank. Everybody's dead. Don't worry about it. Just leave. Just walk away like nothing happened. Unbelievable. How do you reconcile the father's relationship to his son when something like that has happened? And I give you that account back in Octahasis where Nanar was the one that led the revolt, and maybe Enlil had it out for him. He was going to destroy him for what he did. I don't know. We don't know for sure.
It really speaks volumes, though, doesn't it? And like you say, there's just...
Well, exactly. And, the volumes it speaks about is the spirit of Enlil. And I want that to be loud and clear, and his relationship to Nanar Sin, who clearly is the moon god, as I depicted in the Octahasis. It's the very same being. So now all of a sudden you realize that Enlil Yahweh has a son, Nanar Allah, and they've bid two populaces against each other. The Jewish nation and the Palestinians. And you have to ask yourself, is this intentional? Are they dividing and trying to cause the destruction? Or is Nanar truly fighting against his father with all that he has because of this bad relationship? And I'm kind of leaning toward the second one, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't sure before, but after reading this and realizing that how his father treated him, it's pretty damning. And Nanar, from all that I've seen his operations through before the writings ended up in the Quran, whether they're real or not. Listen, Nanar was standing up to evil, and that's to be noted here. Truly,
I think
evil of oppression in the minds, and also the evil of the people of the decree that was sent against his city.
I think that's the thing that it speaks volumes about too, that there is this good or evil, or well, maybe good or bad, or good and evil element or internal workings of the Anunnaki hierarchy, that this keeps changing role all the time. Or
well, I've talked about this a few times and put this model in front of people that, clearly they had a term limit that seemed to be tied to the zodiacal house, and they fought over it at points. Marduk got exiled for asserting himself 2 years too early to take his rulership. And, so the idea of affiliating their names with zodiacal houses should be pretty clear. As a matter of fact, in the Enuma Elish, which surprised me, Enki affiliated himself with the house of Pisces, and Enlil associated with the house of Taurus. So the idea of the bull actually is related to Enlil, which is interesting.
Wow.
But the idea that the zodiacal house was being used to, if it was an equivalence model, that every house with a 30-degree segment is 2,160 years. So that essentially, every 2,160 years, you possibly could see changes in the Anunnaki Council, and possibly there's a power-sharing mechanism where it goes from a clan of the Enkyites to a clan of the Enlilites, and that seemed to be what happened, okay? So the idea that they were vying for this position at the end of a zodiacal house was quite telling. And the way that rulership was implemented based on which clan it came from kind of impacted mankind in a big way in terms of whether they were treated as slaves or they were treated as evolving beings that at some point were going to become fellow Anunnaki. So if it was an Enkiite in the position, they were probably being treated in the latter respect. Whereas if it was an Enlilite in the seat, you'd kind of see what you've been seeing. So the idea that the House of Pisces was related to Enki, you'd think, well, how come over the age of Pisces we didn't see this benevolence from Enki? Well, if you go back, and we're going to get there eventually, they didn't seem to follow strict rules about honoring other people's rulership, even though the zodiacal house might have specified that. So there was a lot of infighting at the change of the zodiacal house, and it just so happens, I think we're seeing exactly that right now as the command is changing. And we were told about this, and now you realize that the Mayan calendar was a timekeeping mechanism to point to this event. So we're seeing that right now. We're at the height of consciousness. We're becoming aware of our enslavement. The holographic state of our reality is starting to be understood from string theory and quantum theory, and also from the disclosure from Thoth himself. So if you've got this advanced scientist that's disclosing the state of our reality in some document, now that you know who he is, you got to pay real close attention to it. And I did, and you'll see that. It comes out in chapter 5. We'll get there eventually, but just very, very seminal.
Yeah. It's the shifting dynamics over long periods, these epochs of the zodiacal house, 2160 years. It's speaking large time frames. Again, it just reverberates the large time frame system in place.
Yeah, well, the Hindus had ideas of these long cycles that show up in the Mahabharata and from the Bhagavad Gita, where you had the Kali Yuga cycle and the Satya Yuga cycle, which I think we're in right now. And they had them related to different wobbles. One of them was much longer than 25,920 years, so it's like pretty crazy that they had this knowledge. Well, I'll tie a little something together for you. In the Sumerian accounts, Inanna got some of the civilization tablets from Enki, who held the tablets of destinies, and went off to the Indus Valley to civilization. And so I think the idea of yoga, the energy body, and all that stuff that showed up in the Indus Valley actually came from her disclosure from these ME tablets. And on her, speaking of that, even though she took them without, permission, and then Enki dispatched someone to go get them back and the whole thing, the reality is that disclosure has really helped mankind a lot. With our alternative models of the energy body and quantized consciousness and all these things from a scientific standpoint, you can look at them and actually they're measurable parameters that showed up in my equation 5a, so from that standpoint, it was interesting how it worked together to weave together in this whole disclosure.
For sure. Gerald, we're out of time. Please give out your website one more time, please, before we wrap up.
Okay. GeraldClark77.com. I've had a little bit of a change on my website and my YouTube channel recently, but if you go to my website, it'll redirect you to the latest data. And I just want to say I'm so excited about having this level of dialogue with a fellow seeker that's coming out the way I intended when I first picked up the microphone and decided I wanted to share my message. So kudos to you, James. I fully support what you're doing, and I hope you become the biggest radio portal on the planet that's telling the truth, because I think next time we're going to talk about where the truth is happening and some other really seminal things in the simulator. So thank you so much for taking the time with me. I know we're 9 or so hours different, and the fact that you're willing to do this at all out hours of the day and night in order to make this happen, I really appreciate that from you.
For sure. Well, you know, a lot of the people don't realize I'm coming at the show from the UK and Ireland, and you know, I do have to get up at 3 a.m. sometimes for shows. It's crazy hours I keep, but I do it because I like it, Gerald, and I do it because there's information and knowledge that's pertinent to me and my truth seeking as well. Gerald, we're out of time again. We've been talking about the seventh planet Mercury rising. Get yourself a copy of this book. It's got so much in there. If you want to know about your origins, if you want to know about where you're going now, on this evolutionary scale, you can get a copy of this book and find out. You listen to your host, James Swagger. Oceans of love and positivity to all my brothers and sisters on this planet, and I'll catch you on the next episode.
That pattern just showed up in a different zodiacal house as it came into the close perihelion with the sun. So those two walked away in complete agreement, and it was documented on video. And it came out in, I don't know, 3 to 5 different newspaper articles, starting from the time that Sitchin wrote his book until I think it was the mid 80s. And then later, even in the 90s, there was another group of people that looked at this again and said, based on all the evidence, you know, Pioneer 10, 11, and all the IRS data, it's clear there is a 10th planet in our solar system. Call it Planet X, which the X in Roman numerals represented 10. And in the scientific realm, X oftentimes is used as a variable that could take on other names, right? So sure. It was appropriately named when they called it Planet X.
Do you think, Gerald, perhaps it's some people call it the Nibiru system, that it's like a red dwarf, brown dwarf type sun with planets orbiting around it. So on some of the orbiting planets of the red brown dwarf, maybe closer to it, getting enough heat, just enough light that they're able to survive on the planet. Obviously, you're not going to survive on a brown dwarf. It's like a miniature little system in itself, Gerald.
Well, that something had to have caused it. So you know, Dr. Harrington was aware of that, and it was not a new problem to scientists. Lots of them were trying to come up with theories of what happened out there. So the idea that he invited Sitchin to come and explain his theory that he had, and it wasn't even really his theory, it was his interpretation of the Babylonian epic of creation, the Enuma Elish. And apparently Harrington had read it as well, and realized that whatever happened there was clearly seminal, and that it warranted developing a satellite or a probe like the infrared astronomical scope satellite to try and find out what was going on out there. So he was very much a part of commissioning that research. And so when he met with Sitchin and they talked about the Enuma Elish and whether it was telling the correct story, the bottom line is Harrington agreed that it was. And the only difference he felt in his mind relative to the pattern or the pathway that had been drawn in the elliptical orbit for Nibiru by Sitchin was that it hadn't fully taken into account the precession of the equinox, but it was the same exact.
Getting into the nit and gritty of the Anunnaki origins in the beginning, and it's just so fascinating. I was just talking to Gerald on the break, and how the penny has dropped even on the show, and I keep having these realizations of in the profound depths of this whole Sumerian tales. First of all, welcome back to the show, Gerald.
Thanks, buddy. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you know, so much to get into another show, Gerald, and I like what we're doing. I like that we're getting into some philosophy, some, you know, tying things together and connecting things, as well as talking about some historical data as well. You need to give the data to philosophize about it, and I like the mix that we're doing here. There's a few things I want to mention, Gerald. I mean, I just briefly.
Yeah, if you look at the Babylonian epic of creation in Enuma Elish, this is over 11 tablets of very complicated planetary interactions. They painted it as I guess they painted it as a celestial battle, an allegory to a celestial battle, billiard ball planets running into each other. Now, imagine your planet, and I have a theory. I've never discussed this with anyone before, but I'll tell you right now. we just went through what and I think we're still going through the galactic center. I think it takes some time to go.
20 years, maybe, John.
Well, minimally, I think it takes 3.5 years, because the 3.5 comes up in Revelations and other places about this 1,260 days from the two witnesses kind of thing. Well, if you tie this back into the timing with what Dr. Kellerman pointed out, it didn't actually happen on December 21st, 2012, even though that's what we were guided to believe. It actually happened in October 28th, 2011. Mm-hmm. So I think, add 3.5 years to that, you could see that we could, if that's true, we could be coming to kind of an apex of the height of consciousness, and to the point where they understood when you left the dark rift that then human consciousness started going to.
We talk about Nibiru, or Nibiru as people call it. I want to just throw this one in, the IRAS satellite data. And this is just for the naysayers out there, Gerald. Nobody talks about this. How did this stuff get swept under the carpet, this IRAS satellite stuff? Let's talk about this.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm actually very surprised that the video I had up for a very long time documenting that Zecharia Sitchin met with Dr. Harrington to discuss this concept of a planet out at the edge of our solar system could have possibly caused the perturbations of the orbital plane of Neptune and Uranus, and Pluto as well, but mostly those bigger planets, because it had to be something quite large to affect a large planet's ecliptic relative to the sun and its orbit. So it put it on an inclined plane. And, so the idea that this was the focal point of our astrologers and scientists to try to understand what happened out there, such that these planets were not on the same orbital plane with the solar ecliptic, that some